I was 61 years old before I understood that the truest things in a man's life come dressed as the dullest. A bill of sale, a handshake, a line of ink on a county paper. I had cracked broncs for 40 years and buried 2 wives and a brother, and still it took watching Silas Renton and the widow Quinn to teach me that, and they never meant to teach anybody anything. They were just trying to keep a roof over a string of horses. It was the autumn of the hard year, the one the valley still called the long winter after, when she rode up the Larkspur Lane with her dead husband's contract folded in her glove, and a proposal in her mouth she'd plainly rehearsed the whole 8 miles. I was foreman of the Larkspur then, had been since Daniel Quinn was alive, and Daniel Quinn had been dead 4 months that morning, thrown crossing Quill Creek in the spring melt, found a half-mile down with his good gray standing guard over him in the willows. Addie Quinn had buried him on the rise behind the house and gone right on feeding the colts the next dawn, because 40 head of green larkspur stock do not stop being hungry for a woman's grief. I'd watched her do it. I'd watched her get thinner and quieter, and I'd watched the man from the cattleman's bank ride out twice with papers, and the second time he hadn't bothered to dismount. So I knew the trouble before she said a word of it. What I didn't know was the answer she'd settled on. "Amos," she said, not getting down, "where would I find Silas Renton?" I'd been forking hay and I stopped with the fork in the air. "Renton," I said. "Silas Renton, the horse breaker. He used to be at the Tolliver place over Saddleback before she stopped. She wasn't a woman who liked to repeat ugly things. Before what happened. What had happened to Silas Renton was that 2 years back a green colt he was gentling for old Cyrus Drake had come apart at the Harmon's Crossing sale ring and crippled a buyer's boy, broke the boy's hip so it never set true. And Cyrus Drake, who'd rushed that colt to the ring against Renton's own warning, who'd wanted his money a month early, Cyrus Drake had stood up in front of the whole valley and said Renton had sold him an outlaw horse knowing it was spoiled. Said it cold and said it twice. And Drake had money and a church pew and 40 years of standing in Greenstone, and Renton had a saddle and a reputation, and you know which of those 2 things a valley believes. Renton lost the Tolliver contract, lost every contract. A man who breaks horses lives on his name the way the rest of us live on bread, and they took his and ate it in front of him. "He's up the old line shack on Saddleback," I said. "Drake near ran him out of the country. He didn't go. Trapping, I hear. Breaking the odd horse nobody respectable will hire him for." I set the fork down. "Addie, that's a hard road to go riding on a guess." "I'm not guessing." She pulled off her glove and took out the contract and held it down to me, and I read it standing in the chaff with the wind off Quill Creek pulling at the corner. It was the remount contract, the one Daniel had landed the winter before he died, the one that was going to make the Larkspur. 40 broke saddle horses to the Army quartermaster, delivered sound at Harmon's Crossing the day of the autumn sale, full price on delivery. It was a fortune for a little outfit, and it was the only thing standing between Addie Quinn and the cattleman's bank. And down at the bottom, in the quartermaster's clerk hand, was the part that had put the gray look on her face. Contracting party to be a man of established standing. The contract not assignable to the estate of a deceased party, save through a lawful husband or male executor of record. "Daniel signed it," she said. "Daniel's dead. The bank holds the lien on the Larkspur and the lien comes due the day of the sale, same as the contract. If I deliver those horses I clear the lien and then some and the place is mine free. If I don't, Mr. Stroud at the bank takes the Larkspur for the debt and buys my horses for nothing at the foreclosure and sells them himself to the Army on a contract he'll have bought up by then." She folded the paper back small. I went to the clerk. I went to the lawyer in Bell County. "There is no version of this where a widow signs that contract, Amos. The Army won't take delivery from me. It has to be a husband." The wind blew. Down in the lower pen the colts were running the fence, all that green larkspur blood needing 6 weeks of hard handling before any of it was fit to sell the Army. And the best horseman in the Greenstone Valley was sitting up a mountain in a lined shack with his name in the dirt, because that suited a man named Cyrus Drake. "So you mean to hire Renton," I said, "to break them?" "I mean to marry him," she said. I didn't say anything for a while. A jay was scolding in the cottonwoods. "It's only business, Amos," she said, and her chin was up but her voice had a fine crack down the middle of it, the way river ice has the day before it goes. "He needs the work in his name back, and I need a husband on a piece of paper and a man who can put 40 green horses under saddle by the sale. He gets a wage and a roof and a fresh start nobody else will give him. I get to keep my husband's farm. We needn't," the chin went a touch higher. "We needn't be anything to each other. It's a partnership, a bargain. I'll have the lawyer write it plain. I keep the deed. I keep the place. He keeps his own self. When the horses are sold and the liens cleared, if he wants to ride on, he rides on, and I'll sign whatever sets him loose." I'd known Addie Quinn since she came to the valley a bride. I'd seen her gentle a mare nobody could touch, and I'd seen her stand at her husband's grave dry-eyed because she'd done her crying where the horses couldn't hear it and lose their nerve. She was not a foolish woman and she was not a soft one, and I understood, standing there, that she had thought this all the way through to the bottom and found no other rock to stand on. "He may say no," I said. "A man with that much taken off him, he may not want to be looked at, married off to save a farm, every tongue in the crossing wagging that the widow had to go up a mountain to find a husband nobody else wanted." "Then he says no," she said, "and I lose the larkspur honest having tried. But he won't, Amos." She gathered her reins. "He won't, because I'm going to offer him the one thing Cyrus Drake took. I'm going to put his name back on a sound string of larkspur horses and walk him into that sale ring upright. Drake said Silas Renton ruins horses. I'm going to let Silas Renton stand in the middle of Harmon's Crossing with 40 of the best broke colts in the territory, and let the whole valley watch him not." She rode up Saddleback alone that afternoon. I wanted to go, and she wouldn't have me. Some bargains a person has to ride to by themselves. He came down the mountain with her 2 days later, the both of them leading a pack horse, and the first thing I'll tell you about Silas Renton is that he came down looking like a man who expected to be turned around at the gate. He was tall and gone lean the way men go who have been living on what they can trap, with 2 years of being nobody set into his face. Black hair shot early with gray, a jaw like a fence post, hands that had been broken and healed crooked in 2 fingers. He looked at the larkspur, at the good barn and the 4 pole pens and the 40 head of green stock, the way a starving man looks at a window with a pie cooling in it, hungry and braced for the door to shut. And then he looked at the horses longer than he looked at anything else, and I watched something come up in him and get pushed back down. He wanted them. He wanted to put his hands on those colts the way a fiddler wants a fiddle, and he didn't trust the wanting, because the last time he'd let himself want a string of horses, the valley had taken them and his good name with them. "Teal," he said to me, "just my name. We'd known each other in the old days a little." "Renton," I said, "welcome to the Larkspur." And I meant it, and I think he heard that I meant it, and it sat wrong on him because he'd forgotten how to be welcomed. They were married that Saturday by the circuit preacher in the front room of the Larkspur, with me and my wife Etta for witnesses, and not another soul. Addie wore her good dark dress, and Silas wore a coat I expect he'd had to dig the moths out of, and they stood a careful 3 feet apart, and said the words like 2 people signing a bill of lading. "No ring," she said afterward. It wasn't that kind of marriage, and a ring would be a lie, though I noticed she didn't sell Daniels either, and didn't wear it. The lawyer's paper got signed before the preacher's did. The deed and the stock remained the sole property of Adelaide Quinn. Silas Renton to receive wage, board, and the public credit of the contracted work. Either party may dissolve the arrangement upon the sale of the contracted horses. Plain as a feed bill. Etta cried anyway, because Etta cries at weddings, even the cold-blooded ones, and Addie put a hand on her arm and said, "Gentle, don't, now. It's only business." And Silas Renton heard her say it, and his face didn't move at all, which is how I first knew it had landed somewhere in him and stuck. They put him in the bunk room off the tack room. She kept the house. That was the bargain, and they kept it like soldiers. Now I will tell you about the winter, because the winter is where the business stopped being business, though neither one of them would have admitted it under oath. He started on the colts the Monday, and inside a week I quit worrying about whether we'd make the sale. I'd cracked horses my whole life and I had never seen hands like his. He didn't fight a colt and he didn't sweet-talk it into a lie either. He'd stand in the round pen in the cold with his breath smoking, and just be a thing the horse could get used to, patient as a fence post, until the colt's own curiosity walked it up to him. Drake had called this man a ruiner of horses. I watched green 3-year-olds that had never had a hand on them follow Silas Renton around that pen by the end of a morning like they'd known him since they were foaled. The crooked fingers didn't slow him a bit. And Addie worked beside him. That was the thing the bargain hadn't bargained for. She wasn't a woman to sit in the house and let a hired husband earn her farm back. She was up before him most mornings, and she knew her own horses' minds. And inside 2 weeks they'd fallen into the rhythm two good hands fall into without ever discussing it. She on the ground line, him in the pen, neither one needing to say the thing the other already knew. They were good together at it. Anybody could see they were good together at it. They just wouldn't look at the seeing. The thaw came on in pieces so small you'd miss them, if you weren't an old man with nothing to do but watch. It came the night the blue roan colt foundered, and the two of them sat up in the barn till dawn walking it, and I came out at first light to find them both asleep sitting against the stall wall a foot apart with the colt standing over them, recovered. And Addie's head had tipped without her leave onto Silas Renton's shoulder, and he was sitting dead still and wide awake so as not to wake her, holding himself like a man holding a bird that had landed on him by accident and might leave if he breathed. It came the day she found out, from Etta, what the real story of the Drake colt was, that Silas had begged Cyrus Drake to give that horse another month, that Drake had run it to the ring early for his money, and then needed a man to blame when it came apart, and had $100 of pew money worth of Valley to believe him. Addie didn't say a word about it to Silas. But that night there was a slice of dried apple pie on the bench outside the bunk room door. And the next night there was coffee left hot on the stove past the hour the house went dark, and she never once said it was for him, and he never once said thank you, and the pie kept appearing. It came in the small mean way the Valley made it come too. Because word had got out, word always gets out, that the widow Quinn had married the ruined Renton off a mountain to save her farm, and there were tongues in Harmon's Crossing that made it filthy, and there were tongues that made it pitiful. And Addie Quinn rode into the crossing for supplies that December and came back with her jaw set white. And I heard from Etta what they'd said to her at the mercantile, the smiling kind of cruelty. Well, Adelaide, a woman does what she must. And I suppose beggars and widows can't be particular. And that night Silas Renton, who never came to the house, stood on the porch with his hat in his crooked hands. "You don't have to ride in for the supplies," he said. "I'll go, let them say it to me." "They'll say it to you twice as ugly," she said. "Then I'll have heard it before," he said. "It rolls off a man that's already on the ground. It oughtn't have to roll off you." She looked at him a long moment in the cold. "It's only business, Silas," she said. "What they say." "Sure," he said. "Only business." And he put his hat back on and went out to the barn, and she stood in the door and watched him go. And I was an old man on the bench in the dark, and I saw her face, and I will tell you it was not the face of a woman conducting a partnership. The hard part of the winter was February, when the long winter earned its name. We got a blizzard that buried the lower pens, and we lost the woodshed roof, and we damn near lost the whole string. And for 3 days and nights it was the three of us against the storm, packing the colts into the barn, keeping the stove fed, breaking ice on the water troughs with axes till our arms gave out. There wasn't any partnership left by the third night. There wasn't any only business. There was just 2 people and an old man keeping 40 horses and each other alive, and somewhere in there the wall came down for good, though it took the rest of the year for either of them to walk through where it had been. The morning the storm broke I came into the barn and found them standing close by the blue roan, the foundered one, recovered now, The one they'd sat up with, and Silas had a hand on the colt's neck and Addie had her hand next to his, not touching near, and they were both looking at the horse and neither one of them was looking at the horse at all. And Silas said low like it cost him, "I had a place once, down in the sandhill country, a wife." Addie went very still. "Fever took her and the baby both, the same week, the winter before I came north. I told myself I was done. Told myself a man that's lost the one home he built doesn't get to want another." He took his hand off the colt. "I didn't come down off that mountain for the work, Mrs. Quinn. I want you to know that before the sale, before whatever you decide. I told myself I did. But I came down because you climbed a mountain to look a ruined man in the face and offer him his name back, and nobody in this life had ever." His voice quit on him. The crooked hand made a fist and let go. "It was never only business. Not for me. I'll keep to the bargain. I'll sign your paper and ride on if that's what you want. I just couldn't carry it into that sale ring being a lie on my side too." And Addie Quinn, who had buried a husband dry-eyed so the horses wouldn't catch her grief, stood in that barn and cried at last, and she did it where a horse could see, which is how I knew she'd stopped being afraid of losing anything. "It was never only business for me either, you stubborn man," she said. "I think I knew it the night you fell asleep sitting up so I could lean on you." He didn't kiss her. Not then, with an old man pretending to fork hay 10 feet off. He took her hand, the crooked fingers around hers, and he held it, and that was the whole of it, and it was plenty. I went and forked hay somewhere else and let them have the barn. The sale came the 3rd Saturday of October, and the whole Greenstone Valley came with it, the way the whole valley always came to the autumn sale at Harmon's Crossing. Wagons backed 3 deep along the fairground rail, the quartermaster's men in blue, every rancher and every banker and every wagging tongue in the country packed around the big sale ring under a cold, bright sky. It was the nearest thing to a spectacle the Greenstone ever got. A year's worth of pride and grudges and money all crowded into one ring on one afternoon. And that year the crowd had an extra reason to come, because everybody knew the widow Quinn was bringing 40 horses broke by the ruined man she'd married, and everybody had an opinion they'd paid nothing for and meant to spend out loud. We drove the string in clean. I want that remembered. 40 head of larkspur colts moving quiet and collected, ears soft, not a spooked eye in the bunch. The best broke string of saddle horses any man at that rail had ever seen come off a little outfit, and you could hear the crowd go from jeering to quiet to leaning in the way a crowd does when it came to laugh and gets shown something instead. The quartermaster walked the line with his book, and I saw him stop being bored. And that's when Cyrus Drake stood up. He'd bought up paper, see? We learned it right there. Stroud at the bank and Cyrus Drake had been thick all year, and Drake had got himself made a sale inspector, and he stood up at the ring rail with his thumbs in his vest and a paper in his hand, and he said it loud enough to carry to the back wagons. He said the larkspur string couldn't be certified sound. He said the man that broke them was a known ruiner of horses, that the valley all remembered the crippled boy, that no honest inspector could let the army take delivery of horses gentled by Silas Renton, without the buyer knowing what he was getting. He said it smooth, and he said it twice, the same as 2 years before, and you could feel it work. You could feel the crowd start to remember the story Drake had taught them, feel the quartermaster's pen hesitate over the book, feel the lien and the contract and the whole larkspur start to slide toward the man who'd planned it that way. And Silas Renton, who had not defended himself 2 years before, who had taken his ruin without a word because a beaten man believes the world has already decided. Silas Renton stepped up onto the bottom rail of that ring where the whole valley could see him, and for the first time since he'd come down off Saddleback, he spoke up. He didn't shout. That was the thing of it. The crowd had to go quiet to hear him, and it did. "You all know me," he said, "or you know what Cyrus Drake told you about me. 2 years back this man rushed a green colt to this ring against my plain warning because he wanted his money a month early, and when that colt came apart and hurt a boy, he stood right about where he's standing now and put it on me because I had no money and no pew and nobody to say different. He let that sit. I didn't fight him. I'll own that. I was ashamed, and I let an ashamed man's silence say I was guilty. That was my mistake, and it cost a boy, and it cost me, and I have carried it up a mountain and back. He looked down the rail at Drake. But these horses aren't silent. Look at them. You came to see if a ruiner's horses would come apart. Walk the line. Put your worst rider on the worst one. Cyrus Drake can stand here and tell you what I am. I'll let 40 horses tell you what I am instead. Sound, gentle, and honest, everyone, and I'll stand good with my own back on every head I broke. That's the difference between us, Drake. You brought paper, I brought the horses. I have stood in a lot of crowds. I have never heard one turn the way that one turned. It started somewhere in the back. An old rancher named Prout who'd lost a son in the war and didn't truck with men who hid behind paper, and he called out, "Then let's see 'em rode." And it caught, and it ran the rail like fire in dry grass. 50 voices and then 100, ride 'em, ride 'em. The whole valley roaring for the proving, and the quartermaster, no fool, and no friend of a banker who tried to corner his contract, shut his book and said the army would take its own count of soundness. Thank you, and called for riders. They rode them. All afternoon, in front of the whole Greenstone, hard men put those colts through every cruel, honest test there is, and not one came apart, not one. And every time a colt stood quiet under a strange, rough rider, you could hear the valley make a sound, and every sound was a nail coming out of Silas Renton's name. By the last light, the quartermaster signed for all 40 at full price, and Cyrus Drake's inspector's paper wasn't worth the ink. And it came out. Prout and 2 others made sure it came out. Loud, at the rail, what Drake had done, the bought paper, the deal with Stroud, the whole rotten clockwork of it. And a valley that will believe a lie about a quiet man for 2 years will turn on the man who told it the minute it's shamed. Which isn't justice exactly, but I've learned to take what comes. Addie Quinn took the army's draft to the cattleman's bank window set up right there at the fair, and she paid the lien off in front of Stroud's own face, every dollar, and the larkspur was hers free and clear, deed in her own name, the way the bargain had always said it would be. They tore up the lawyer's paper that night. I know because Etta and I were there for it, asked special, in the front room where they'd married like 2 people signing a feed bill. Silas had the paper out. Either party may dissolve the arrangement upon the sale of the contracted horses, and he set it on the table between them, his to use as much as hers. Horses are sold, he said, liens cleared, by the paper I'm free to ride on and you're free to send me. He turned it so it faced her. It's your deed and your farm and your name, and it always was. So it's your say, Addie, the business is done. Anything past it isn't business. She looked at the paper a long while. Then she picked it up and tore it in half and in half again, and she fed it into the stove, and she came back and stood close, closer than the careful 3 feet they'd married at. I don't want a husband on paper, she said. I've got past needing one of those. She took his crooked hand in both of hers. I want the man who sat up all night so a sick colt wouldn't die alone. I want the man who'd ride into a town full of ugly tongues so they'd say it to him instead of me. If you want to ride on, Silas Renton, you ride on with my blessing and you'll always have a fire here. But if you stay, stay because you chose it, and I chose it, and not one line of it is business. I never wanted to ride anywhere off this place from the first morning, he said. I just didn't believe a ruined man got to stop and stay. Then stay, she said. He stayed. The circuit preacher came back through in the spring and married them a second time, and this one they meant. And this time there was a ring, and this time they didn't stand 3 feet apart, and Etta cried again, and so, I'll admit it, did the old foreman, standing in the back with his hat in his hands. The larkspur came good after that. Silas Renton broke horses in the Greenstone Valley for 30 more years, and they came from 3 territories to buy them. And no man ever again said anything about a ruined name, because a valley's memory is short for its sins, and long for the horses it covets. Addie kept her deed and ran her farm, and they ran it together, partners in the way that has nothing to do with paper, and they raised 2 boys on that place who could both sit a colt before they could spell their names. I've thought about it a lot, being old now and having time. How the whole thing started as the dullest arrangement two desperate people ever struck: a wage, a roof, a name on a contract, its only business. How they meant every cold word of it. And how the business was just the barn they built the real thing inside of, the way you'll put up plain pole walls to keep the weather off something you didn't yet know was going to be a home. She told me once, years on, sitting on the porch watching him work a colt in the low pen, that she'd ridden up that mountain certain she was making a trade and nothing more. I asked her when she'd known different. The night of the storm, she said, when there wasn't any house and any barn and any his and mine left, just the three of us and the horses and the cold, and I looked over at him breaking ice with an axe at 2 in the morning for stock that weren't even his, and I thought, that's not a man you've hired. That's a man you've been waiting for and didn't have the sense to know it. She smiled, watching him. It was the worst winter of my life. I wouldn't trade a single freezing hour of it. Down in the pen, the colt walked up to Sela's Renton on its own, the way they always did, and put its nose in his crooked hand. And the old horsebreaker stood still as a fence post and let it. And over the colt's back he looked up at the porch at her, the way he'd been looking at her for 30 years. It was never only business. I don't believe it ever was, not even on the paper. Some bargains are just love that hasn't been introduced to itself yet.